Good evening, everyone. My name is Ulysses Smith, and on behalf of the New York City Bar Association, its Task Force on the Rule of Law, which is chaired by Stephen L. Cass, its United Nations Committee, chaired by Clayton T. Chaney, and Council on International Affairs, chaired by Mark A. Meyer, and co-sponsored by the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual event entitled The Global Multilateral System, the Role of the United States, and the Prospects for Addressing Today's Greatest Challenges. Tonight's event is the third program in the City Bar's International Rule of Law Forum, which seeks to identify priorities for the United States' recommitment and re-engagement with international law and institutions. Previous events in our series, which can be found on the City Bar's website, address the rule of law and authoritarian ascendance, as well as the relationship between China, the United States, and the rule of law. Next year, we plan to host two final events to close out the series on the role of the private sector in advancing the rule of law and on the intersection between the rule of law and migration. Dates for these events, which we hope will take place in person at the City Bar, will be announced early in the new year. As a former chair of the City Bar's United Nations Committee, and generally as a UN fan, tonight's event is especially near and dear to my heart. The multilateral system, born in its present form out of the ashes of World War II, was one of the great achievements of the 20th century. Based on principles of cooperation, human rights, justice, and the rule of law, it was built to prevent the world from descending to the levels of horrible violence and destruction that were seen during the world wars of the first half of the century. In the years since its founding, it has evolved to take on many of the greatest challenges the world faces, from global health to climate change, to peace and security, migration, and sustainable and just economic and social development. The purpose of the multilateral system and the need for such a system of global governance have never been clearer. However, it is possible from a place of great respect, admiration, and true affection, which I have, to recognize that the system as it currently exists does not always fulfill the purposes given to it. This is often not the fault of the system itself, but rather of the limitations imposed on it as a result of national politics or maneuvering for geopolitical influence. Our own government in the United States is both a part of this problem and a key player in solving it. This is what our event tonight is about. We will have two opening keynote speakers who will get us started on these important topics. They will be followed by a panel moderated by the chair of the City Bar's UN Committee, Clayton Chaney. Our first keynote, Mr. Richard Gowan, is an esteemed observer of the United Nations. He currently serves as UN Director for the International Crisis Group, having previously worked with the European Council on Foreign Relations, New York University's Center on International Cooperation, the Foreign Policy Center in London, as well as having taught at SIPA at Columbia. Our second keynote speaker, the Honorable Hugh T. Dugan, served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President and served as Senior Director for International Organization Affairs in the National Security Council in 2020. As part of the administration, Hugh drew on his 26 years service as US delegate to the United Nations and senior advisor to 11 US permanent representatives, beginning in 1989. I believe that makes him one of, if not the most longest-serving US representatives at the United Nations. In 2019, Hugh was instrumental in brokering the release of Americans held overseas, serving as Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. He has also taught at Seton Hall. He's a graduate from Georgetown, the Fletcher School, and the Wharton School. Hugh is currently producing a musical about the people of the earliest America, which we hope you'll hear a little bit about that too. Maybe Hugh, see. Now, with introductions out of the way, Richard, over to you, please. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ulysses, and thank you to everyone for joining us on this cold New York night to talk about the UN. I hope that I'm clearly audible. Yeah, good. So look, I feel very humble in this distinguished company. I am not a lawyer. I am merely a political analyst, and my job for the International Crisis Group is to watch the Security Council and watch the UN up close and try and keep track of the political dynamics in the multilateral system. In that context, I've spent much of the last 5 years following the Trump administration's approach to the UN, but I think Hugh will be able to say more about that. And then this year, I have been analyzing how the Biden administration has been re-engaging with the UN. And of course, you will remember that President Biden and his ambassador in New York, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, promised us in late 2020 that America was back, that diplomacy was back, and that multilateralism was back. The current administration pitched very hard that they were going to re-engage with the United Nations after a period of tense and frankly sometimes pretty chaotic UN-US relations under Trump. So what I will do in the next 10 minutes is try and give you a sense of how we see this process of re-engagement going. I will talk first about perceptions of the new US administration at the UN, and then I will say a little bit about how some of America's adversaries on the international stage have responded to Biden's policies. And I'll be focusing, of course, primarily on China and Russia. I'm going to say a little bit at the end of my remarks about how other members of the UN, and specifically poorer developing countries that are struggling with the burdens of COVID, see US policy at the moment. Because clearly one of the major questions around the multilateral system today is whether the big powers that run the UN and run organizations like the World Health Organization are going to actually be able to lift the rest of the global community out of the swamp of COVID. But anyway, let's look at the process of US engagement first. I mean, the first point I would make is that I think most diplomats sitting around Turtle Bay would agree that the Biden administration has delivered a fundamental change in the way that the US is engaging at the UN. By the end of Trump's term, relations were incredibly tense, not only between the US and its adversaries, but also between the US and many of its allies in the UN system. And those of you that followed this process closely will remember that in 2020, there was enormous friction between the US and its European allies in particular over the fate of the Iranian nuclear deal. And I think Hugh may have more to say about that. From the moment that Linda Thomas-Greenfield came to New York, we saw a conscious effort by the incoming team to rebuild bridges and present a positive and warmer approach to the rest of the UN system. And we have seen a notable calming down, frankly, of tensions in the Security Council and other forums, resulting from this US process of re-engagement. But although the Biden administration overall gets positive reviews for its positioning in Turtle Bay, I think that a lot of other members of the UN are still somewhat unclear about how seriously this administration takes multilateral diplomacy. We've seen Biden's re-engagement with the UN vary very considerably, issue by issue and crisis by crisis. So there have been some areas where there's been little doubt that the US has been very serious about re-engaging. And the most obvious of those, I think, is around climate change. And the president and Special Envoy Kerry clearly made an enormous effort to try to get climate diplomacy on track prior to the Glasgow conference last month. And more generally, the US messaging around climate change has changed entirely since the Trump era. This is also one topic on which the US has made a point of doing its best to cooperate with China. But on other issues, America's willingness to re-engage has been less clear. Just to look at the UN body that I know best, in the Security Council, we've seen enormous differences between how the US has treated the situation in Syria and how it treated the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians that spiked in May. In the case of Syria, the administration put a huge amount of effort and was ultimately successful in persuading Russia to renew the mandate for UN humanitarian aid into rebel-held areas of Syria that was up for renewal in July of this year. Russia had indicated that it might cancel that mandate using its veto in the Security Council. The US, all the way up to President Biden, really leaned on Moscow and brought a coalition of partners to lean on Moscow to ensure that the aid continues. The aid is continuing today, and it basically feeds and waters about 3 million people in a very desperate situation. By contrast, when fighting spiked between Israel and the Palestinians this May, the US was absolutely insistent that the UN should play no part in responding to the crisis. And while other countries, including China, but also US allies like Norway and France, argue that the Security Council should make a statement, at least, on this outburst of violence, the White House time and again refused to consider even the most limited of UN comments on the violence or any limited UN call for calm. The White House argued that it would be better for Egypt and other powers in the region to engage in quiet diplomacy and keep the Security Council out of it. Now, this difference between the two situations shouldn't be a total surprise. The US has, after all, frequently sided with Israel in the Security Council during many previous administrations. And in fact, it is arguable that the best approach was precisely the one that the Biden administration advocated, quiet diplomacy rather than large-scale multilateral declaration making. But nonetheless, the lesson that a lot of other diplomats took away from the May events was that the US is only going to engage with the UN when it feels like it, and that actually it's not deeply committed to the UN in many security crises today. I think other diplomats have also taken that lesson away from the Afghan crisis, where the US blocked early efforts by countries including the UK, France, and others to have the Security Council weigh in on the situation around the fall of Kabul, although more recently, the US has been more willing to work through the UN in dealing with the Taliban. So all in all, I think that there is a sense that, yes, the US is back at the UN, but it's only partially back. And it's only back in a rather selective fashion, rather than completely buying in to a multilateral vision of world order. Now, this obviously contrasts with the much greater level of disengagement we saw under Trump, but it also contrasts with the last years of the Obama administration, when actually Obama and his advisors put considerably more energy into multilateral diplomacy, whether it was over Syria or over issues like climate change. And there was a real sense that the US was, more deeply committed to multilateralism than it seems to be today. Quickly then, how have other powers responded to this partial US re-engagement? I would say that China has fundamentally hedged its position. On some questions, the Chinese have made a point of trying to find common ground with the US, of trying to improve relations with the US. We've seen that over climate change. We saw it in the early months of the administration in discussions over COVID at the UN. The Chinese have fundamentally wanted to avoid unnecessary arguments with the US in New York. But there have been a lot of issues on which China has not been willing to compromise with the US. Most obviously, for example, any efforts to reverse the coup in Myanmar, or efforts to end the horrific war in Ethiopia, which has been sort of growing and growing while China and Russia have blocked Security Council action all this year. Russia has taken, I think, an even harder line, frankly, than China towards the US at the UN. There have been some moments, as in the discussions over Syria, which I referred to, where the Russians have been willing to make some compromises with the US, but on a lot of issues, and obviously now, especially in discussions around Ukraine, the Russians seem to be taking a hard line in the Security Council and to be deliberately trying to push back against US efforts to invest in the UN. And I think the single greatest concern that I hear amongst diplomats now around Turtle Bay is that the tensions around Ukraine will escalate, and an escalation of the Ukrainian conflict, possibly to the level of an all-out war between Russia and Ukraine, will make it almost impossible for the US and Russia to work on other issues, such as the situation in Syria, in the UN in the future. Lastly, one thing I'd really like to emphasize to everyone, though, is you shouldn't just see the way the UN works in terms of three countries, China, Russia, and the US. It's very easy to analyze the UN in terms of the high-level P5 politics, but in fact, the UN is also a space where the US can reach out and influence a much broader range of countries, especially developing countries, countries in the global south, that don't regularly engage with the US through NATO or the European Union or other more Western forums. A lot of these countries, African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries, were nervous about US policy in the Trump era, but they've also become nervous about the rise of China. And many of them are nervous about their level of economic vulnerability to China. And what they want to see in the UN is a US that actually listens to their concerns about COVID vaccines, about managing the negative consequences of climate change in their territories. And we have seen the Biden administration respond at least in part to these concerns. Biden has promised some more funding to help poorer countries adapt to climate change. President Biden convened a summit during the UN General Assembly week in September on getting vaccines out globally so that 70% of the world's population could be vaccinated against COVID by September 2022. So the US is responding to the concerns of the broader UN membership, but still I hear a lot of UN members saying it is difficult for us when we are so economically exposed to China, when China is increasingly positioning itself as a leader in the international system. We need to find a way to navigate the situation, and we need to believe that the US really cares about our needs. And I would emphasize the UN is actually a good space for the US to show some of those countries in Africa and elsewhere that it does care about their needs. And that is one part of the bigger contest for global leadership that is now developing, I think, between Washington and Beijing. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was terrific. A great way to kick us off, making a case with lots of excellent examples of US partial re-engagement with the UN, perhaps not buying into a full, robust vision of multilateralism, but definitely coming back into the fold in some ways. That's a really good place to start. I hope you can stick around for a little bit. I want to go straight to Hugh, but we do have a couple questions coming in. So if possible for you to stick around, Richard, we'll get Hugh's comments on the table as well, and then maybe we can do a short round of questions before we go to the panel, and I hand over to Clayton. Hugh, I did a long, esteemed, detailed introduction of you a few moments ago. So if I may, I'm just going to hand it over to you now. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. Yep.
Very good. Thank you, Ulysses. Today's topic on the global multilateral system, the role of the United States, and the prospect for addressing today's great challenges is a timeless topic that needs frequent revisiting, far from being a one and done. I'm grateful for the opportunity today to work with the critical mass of Americans you've assembled to do so, and thank you to the New York City Bar Association. This topic boils down to a kernel matter, that being the effective U.S. participation in multilateral processes. Effective means the promotion of liberal internationalism, dedicated stewardship of the international machinery by the U.S. and others, expert American delegations and guidance, and constant maintenance of international arrangements so that they remain relevant and consequential. So I would repeat, today's topic boils down to effective U.S. participation in multilateral processes. Since today's topic is so broad and involves so many of us, I opt to present a 10-minute appetizer tray of very brief thoughts and at best some paragraphs to tempt discussion tonight and thereafter. Last week, I participated in another online event promoting the rules-based international order that's sine qua non of better life on Earth. There, I added to the chat screen a humble correction by the addition of another word, which I thought was missing. I'll share that word here with full disclosure that it adds yet more syllables to our multisyllabic jargon. But it is critical, and if nothing else rings memorable in my remarks tonight, let it be this. The word is liberal. It must be voiced, and it must not be assumed. Here is the correction: the rules-based liberal international order. Otherwise, our adversaries would promote a rules-based international order, spelled with the silent authoritarian before the phrase international order. I see the point of today's program as advancing a rules-based liberal international order, one which promotes the universal equality of individuals as well as individual and collective freedoms, while respecting each state's sovereign equality. Liberal internationalism entails principled multilateralism, and each multilateral forum is first and foremost an organization, indeed a high maintenance organization, if it is to make a difference. To my next point, judging by the expertise on tonight's program, we will eyeball and sample a variety of issues. These 31 flavors have something for everyone, as does the agenda in most multilateral sessions. Here is my point. Who is taking the bigger responsibility to make sure that there is in fact an ice cream parlor to serve up these 31 flavors? Whether we want pistachio or chunky monkey, there are more fundamental quandaries and chores to manage to make sure that there is in fact a functioning place to do this business, such as what are its principal objectives? Who is the customer? What are its deliverables? How does it produce them? What are the competitive threats to these multilateral fora? And of course, how much does everything cost? And how does that get paid? Each of the multilateral fora is an organization first and foremost, and as does any business, each requires effective stewardship. Member states are the owners and shareholders, and their time, talent, and treasure is as critical for mainframe maintenance as it is for mastering the latest software. Policy connoisseurship is fine and valuable, but what if our dives go so deep that we find the ship above has gone adrift, or worse, is on a course of our adversaries' choosing? Engaging multilaterally and stewarding its machinery effectively depends upon a specialized diplomatic skill set tailored to this process. just as you wouldn't have your personal banker try to shout it out with the rough trade on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, you wouldn't expect a trained one-on-one negotiator to take effortlessly to the Byzantine rough and tumble of intergovernmental fora. The effectiveness of US participation in any such setting depends upon talented operatives there. And regrettably, for decades, our bench has become thinner and thinner, while those of our adversaries are getting deeper by design. Vesting the US in multilateral chat rooms and star chambers is becoming easier all the time. Long-term American reluctance about multilateral job shops has constrained its resources and incentives within the diplomatic bureaucracy in Washington and abroad, and it's worked against mastering the distinct properties and opportunities of multilateral means for securing America's interests. In church, merely showing up, genuflecting in the ordained direction, making a donation, and going through the motions really doesn't work. Similarly, at the UN, such body language surrenders to others, more willing and prepared to achieve their interests through multilateral means. My point, defending the rule of law in such places requires investing in the skill set of our delegations and their bureaucracy in Washington, altogether stuck in a telephone tech world, while others, for example, China, are preparing to game the UN metaverse. So without dutifully managed international machinery and skilled practitioners, the US risks the relevance of the institutions of the rules-based liberal international order. Such an order does not live in a frictionless world. We must consciously develop the urgency that drove the greatest generation to create this machinery that we take for granted. We must overcome any contentment we harbor that 75 years has developed a permanent vaccine against the expression of baser instincts between nations. Nor have those 75 years created an autopiloted device relieving member states from taking unpopular but necessary decisions to keep multilateralism a best first option. Believing otherwise has been tantamount to surrendering the machinery to its managers, its own bureaucrats, who in typical style are not brave, but know how to stay employed. Case in point, during the global pandemic, something affecting each person on Earth in unprecedented measures, the United Nations was missing in action to the man on the street. It was the role of the Secretariat to have risen to that occasion and identify its resources for rallying the world in the most stressful of time. The organization's longtime scripting as a beacon of hope, a centralized information exchange place, a talk shop to absorb and anticipate threats, a readiness device for technical assistance and operational activities. All this was missing in nearly every news piece and around nearly every kitchen table. It did not rise to the occasion. The General Assembly did not convene to address the pandemic until October 2020, merely to echo what we all knew through its speechifying and hand-wringing. Even though the world postponed everything from weddings to the Olympics, the UN Secretariat insisted on celebrating its 75th birthday. And as tone deaf as that was, public notice was even less. Elsewhere, where was the much vaunted nimbleness of the UN system to coordinate its many specialized agencies? That oversized palette of colors they represent continues relatively untouched by the many thousands of international civil servants. They did not propose, and very little was disposed. In particular, WHO became more derided in its controversies and shortcomings were made apparent eclipsing whatever contribution it was claiming to be making. Sadly, too, the re-upping of the Secretary General took place with no evident input by civil society or even member states. It was a rubber stamp of the quickest sort that I'd ever witnessed in my time, when mere 5 years ago, there was a major launch to publicize the choice of the Secretary General and identify options through debate and many public programs. That just did not take place this year. Nor did any true discussion about re-upping the executive director of the World Health Organization, which is now on schedule to occur in the next few months, without any opposition or meaningful discussion on the global scale. So I've tried to decidedly speak of a rules-based international liberal international order. And I suggest that to support that order, we master the stewardship of multilateral organizations in order to realize their principles and purposes. We must also invest immediately in America's diplomatic corps' mindsets and skill sets for our effective participation in those fora. And we must take note that multilateral fora as go-tos might not be theirs if they are not attuned to the particular needs and aspirations laid on their doorsteps. With that, thank you for your attention and for your studied views on global multilateral system, the role of the US, and prospects for addressing today's greatest challenges. I look forward to tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. That was also terrific and completely fascinating. And Richard, I would like to come back to you if we may. I want to give you a chance to respond if you would like, or come in on a couple of those points. If I can take inspiration from Hugh's appetizer tray and 31 flavors imagery, I wonder if one way to tie his remarks to your remarks is the notion that perhaps what's happening when you talk about the Biden's administration's partial re-engagement is in some ways coming from a place where some of Hugh's observations are coming from, which is that picking and choosing where the UN can and where US engagement with the UN can advance US interests is what's front of mind, as opposed to a wholesale embrace of the multilateral system and the vision of multilateralism that may have existed at a prior time, is part of what's motivating what you're seeing, potentially the Biden's views about where the UN is helpful to engage and participate in, and less so where it doesn't see that interest. In any case, I also just want to open the floor to you for a little bit, if we may, and we do have a couple questions from the audience that I'll bring back to both you and Hugh as well.
So yeah, it's always great to listen to Hugh, and I think we disagree and enjoy each other's positions in equal measure. I would say, Hugh, I think some of your complaints about UN behavior during COVID are not quite fair. The General Assembly did actually pass 2 resolutions on the emerging pandemic in April of 2020. So the General Assembly was at least discussing it before October, although I would fully agree the General Assembly did no more than talk about the issue. And the Security Council did want to pass a resolution on COVID for much of the first half of last year, which it would have done had the US not threatened to veto it, because it contained a passing reference to the World Health Organization, which of course at that point was organization non grata in Washington. So, I mean, I think it is true that the UN did not fully rise to the occasion, but there were a number of states, including the United States, that were holding it down at certain times. I think, in fact, though, I would agree very much on the point that, the pandemic did bring out exactly how low a profile the UN has globally, and how little statements from figures like the Secretary General resonate. And I think that's a real source of concern and a real source of reflection in New York at present. Ulysses, to you. Oh, and by the way, I would agree with a number of other points you made about the amazing capacity of some, but not all, international officials to focus on their jobs rather than the greater good. That is certainly something that I think is a reality. But Ulysses, to your point, yeah, I mean, every US administration has a selective and mixed approach to the value of multilateralism. That is not in doubt. And US administrations are on a spectrum between a greater degree of commitment, such as the second Obama administration, and a more skeptical stance, such as the first Bush administration or the Trump administration. Now, Biden, I would say, is clearly closer to Obama than Bush, but his instincts don't seem to be as UN-centric as Obama's once were. I think the other thing to say, though, and what is going to dominate US attitudes to the UN, whoever is president, from whatever party, is now a huge concern about China's interest in the UN system. And this is what comes through Hugh's comments, but also some of my comments. I think there is now a bipartisan belief in Washington that China has gained too much influence in the UN system. And I think there is a bipartisan belief that this has to be countered. The question is how you counter it. Do you counter it by walking away from those institutions where China's influence is evident, as in the WHO? Or do you, as the US is about to try in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, do you engage more? Do you lean in? Do you try and sort of beat the Chinese point by point on a tactical basis when discussing human rights? So I think everyone shares this overarching concern about China, which is now, after all, the overarching framing of US foreign policy. But there is still a sort of a fundamental tactical difference about how you respond to the Chinese challenge.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate that. Hugh, if we can come back to you, again, offering the opportunity to respond to anything that Richard may have said, but I also want to put out a question. I'm gonna take the liberty of editing it slightly, but it picks up on a couple themes that that both you, Hugh, and Richard have touched on. China, perhaps lurking in the background of this question, I don't know, but it asks, what is the implication of the rise of authoritarian governments in relation to the outlook for international cooperation? I think both of you have sort of talked about that issue, but I think the question is going a little bit further than either of you have gone, I believe, so far, which is to ask, what are the implications for international cooperation? What is the future? What does the future look like, I suppose, for multilateral governance, where you have authoritarian models of government vying with significant degrees of power and influence with the liberal democracies, as you talked about it, Hugh?
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate Richard's views and take them aboard, of course. When it comes to the authoritarian nature of China's ambitions, they're clearly importing them into the UN, not just through the leadership of several specialized agencies of which we're very familiar, but they're grounding their future diplomats even today with expertise on how to engage in multilateral processes of all sorts, and to master the secretariat and the chessboards of all of those different entities and opportunities. The real risk, I think, is that these were liberal international organizations at root. If we somehow excise the liberal nature of these international organizations, we really render them even less relevant and perhaps weaker than we anticipated, and that could happen quite quickly. It's easy to spot when a major state is trying to drive a truck through an international organization. It's unmistakable. And the US, I think, for the sake of a believable UN international organization, has been very careful to try to respect the sovereign equality of others, take its turn in the organization, and be respectful of its distinct properties as a meeting place that is basically a voluntary place for sovereign states to decide to do business. If China turns it into something that's just Beijing overseas, so to speak, an ordering place where it can assert its will and do so through clever means of funding certain things, mastering certain tactics, getting people placed in key positions and managing things under the table. It's going to damage the UN's brand. Essentially, it can hijack the brand for just so long, but I don't know if it could ever be retrieved to what it was prior. Thank you.
And Richard, last question for you, and then we'll hand it over to Clayton and the panel. But picking up on this on a similar theme, what do you see in the future in a world, in a liberal world order, in a multilateral system where perhaps the authoritarian models of governance are vying with significant power and influence along with the liberal democracies, so to speak? Where do you see the UN's effectiveness and ability to be a leader and solver of global problems 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road with those two competing models of governance vying for authority?
So the older I get, the less I can see into the future. And I'm not sure I can predict where we will be in 4 years, let alone 20 years. But I mean, I would make 2 points. The first relates directly to what you just said about China expanding its influence in UN agencies. You can frame it in terms of a Chinese takeover of liberal institutions. I would actually put it in slightly different terms, which is institutions that were fundamentally designed to be apolitical are becoming heavily politicized. So the World Health Organization, it's meant to be boring. It is meant to be a technocratic agency that is good at dealing with things like tracking malaria. But last year we did see it become a battleground politically over COVID. Similarly, I think you mentioned the International Telecommunications Union. And China and the US and others, Russia included, are really competing for influence in the ITU because it happens to be the place where standards for 5G will be decided. Now, the ITU used to be the sort of byword for dull agency in Geneva, but now it's become a sort of a really very serious political concern. So I think we're seeing multilateral agencies that were meant to be technocratic suddenly becoming political battlegrounds. So that, I mean, there I think I totally agree with you. That is a huge problem for the credibility. The second thing I would point to, especially for an audience with a legal bent, is trust. Right now, for the reasons that Hugh says, it is simply impossible to imagine major powers trusting each other enough to agree to big legally binding treaties on things like artificial intelligence and other sort of evolving global challenges. We live in an era where the best that the UN is able to agree is sort of more vague sets of goals with quite controversial monitoring mechanisms like the climate change goals. And I think that I find it hard to imagine that we will go through another period like the 1940s or the 1990s, where big powers had the level of confidence and trust in each other to go into making new big treaties going forward. And that leads us, I think, into the next panel, because this sort of inability to agree strong binding treaties on the evolving challenges to world order is a real restraint on what the UN can be expected to do.
Thank you, Richard. That is a really great way to segue to our panel. Thank you for that. A really fascinating discussion, really, from both of you. Our gratitude and thanks for being with us and getting us started. Now, Clayton, over to you. We look forward to your panel.
Great, thank you, Ulysses. Good evening. My name is Clayton Chaney, and I'm a co-chair of the New York City Bar Association's United Nations Committee. I'd really like to thank both Hugh and Richard for just doing an excellent job of setting the table and giving us a broad overview of the issues at the UN, which is a great way to transition to our panel, where we'll really focus in on 3 specific issues and how the multilateral system is addressing those issues. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to the panel discussion of the program. But first, I'd like to thank the City Bar, my colleagues on the United Nations Committee, the Task Force on the Rule of Law, the Council on International Affairs, and at the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law for hosting this event. I would specifically like to thank City Bar President Sheila Boston, Chair of the Task Force for the Rule of Law, Steve Cass, and Ulysses Smith from the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law for their continued support and contributions to the International Rule of Law Forum. Additionally, I'd like to thank all of you for attending this event this evening. And most of all, I would like to thank our esteemed speakers for volunteering their time and expertise for this important program. The speakers on this panel have deep expertise on emerging global challenges that can only adequately be addressed through multilateral engagement and action, as the challenges transcend national borders and impact every region of the world. I believe that climate change, global public health, and cybersecurity are 3 of the most pressing threats to global stability and human prosperity, which makes them perfect topics to address during this panel. The ability of the international community to address these global threats will significantly shape the trajectory of the future international landscape. The multilateral system and multilateral institutions, including the United Nations and other multilateral forums, must play an essential role in tackling the difficult legal and policy challenges presented by each issue. During this panel, we aim to explore how multilateral institutions are addressing these global challenges, what reforms are needed within the institutions to allow them to successfully combat the threats they pose, and what role the United States should play within these institutions. Should you have any questions during the panel, feel free to use the question and answer function on the Zoom call to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to get to everybody's question depending on time. With that, I'd like to introduce our 3 distinguished speakers on this panel. Sue Biniaz currently serves as the Deputy to the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, leading the climate negotiations team. For more than 25 years, Ms. Biniaz served as the lead climate lawyer for the US State Department, where she played a central role in all major international climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. During her tenure at the State Department as a deputy legal advisor, she also supervised the Treaty Office and issues related to the law of the sea, Somali piracy, the Western Hemisphere, human rights, law enforcement, and private international law. Prior to that, she led the State Department's Legal Office for Oceans, Environment, and Science, as well as the Legal Office for European Affairs. She attended Yale College and earned her JD from Columbia Law School. Welcome, Sue. Jose Alvarez is the Herbert and Rose Rubin Professor of International Law at New York University School of Law, where he teaches courses on international law, foreign investment, and international organizations. He served as the president of the American Society for International Law from 2006 to 2008, and was the co-editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law. Before entering academia on a full-time basis, Professor Alvarez was an attorney advisor with the Office of Legal Advisor of the United States Department of State, where he worked on cases before the Iran-US Claims Tribunal, served on the negotiation team for bilateral investment treaties and the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and was the legal advisor to the Administration on Justice Program in Latin America, coordinated by the Agency of International Development. Professor Alvarez attended Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and Oxford University. He is a member of the US Department of State's Advisory Committee on Public International Law, serves on the board of the Center for Reproductive Rights, and was a special advisor on public international law to the International Criminal Court's first prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo. Welcome, Jose. And finally, Kristin Eichensteiner is the Martha Lubin Karsh and Bruce A. Karsh Bicentennial Professor of Law and Director of the National Security Law Center at the University of Virginia School of Law, where she teaches courses on cybersecurity, foreign relations, international law, and national security law. She clerked for Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and Sonia Sotomayor of the Supreme Court of the United States, and for Judge Merrick B. Garland of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She also served as a special assistant to the legal advisor of the U.S. Department of State and practiced at Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C., where she specialized in appellate litigation and international and national security law, including cybersecurity issues. She received her JD from Yale Law School. Welcome, Kristin. Sue, I would like to turn to you first. Having just returned from the COP26 in Glasgow, and with climate change being a truly existential crisis facing humanity, we would welcome your insights on how the multilateral system is addressing the challenges posed by climate change.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. Well, before I turn to the climate regime, I thought I'd make just 2 points about quote unquote multilateralism. You know, I'm one of those people who is a bit skittish about the term for a couple of reasons. I find it when you use it in the legal sense, it's confusing because some people use it in the sense of just meaning an agreement that has 3 or more parties. Some people use it to mean, you know, a global regime. And some people don't use it in the legal sense at all. They use it in the political sense of meaning, you know, the opposite of unilateral action. And some use it to mean a UN process, and some don't mean a UN process. So I tend to actually avoid multilateral and multilateralism and, you know, try to get much more specific about what people have in mind. So that's point 1. Point 2 about multilateralism is I don't necessarily think, in my experience, I guess, a multilateral, or particularly at the global end of the spectrum, is necessarily always a superior approach. And I'll tell you why, at least in the environmental area. Multilateral approaches can have certain advantages. They can promote environmental effectiveness where you need action in many countries to address a particular problem. They can reduce competitiveness concerns if you have the right parties involved, and they can, of course, enjoy more legitimacy than other approaches. But at the same time, these benefits can sometimes come at a cost. A multilateral approach might slow things down or even impede action, depending on what the voting rules are, particularly if it's a consensus body where any one party can you know, block agreement. Sometimes countries aren't motivated to take action, and we certainly saw this in the International Civil Aviation Organization, where it basically took the unilateral action by the EU to get, or, you know, kind of provoke the ICAO process into taking action. And a multilateral regime often enjoys enhanced legitimacy, but it can also lose legitimacy if it is unable to take necessary action. So those are just some preliminary comments about, you know, the overarching topic here. But now let me get into the climate change regime in particular. The climate regime is about as multilateral, quote unquote, as you can imagine. It's global. It includes almost every country in the world, almost 200 countries, and it operates by consensus. So a decision coming out of that body pretty much reflects, you know, the entire world. And arguably, this gives the regime a certain amount of strength, but it has also made it extremely difficult to reach agreement over the years. And I want to give like the world's shortest history of the climate regime starting now. It took many years, even decades of trial and error to get to the Paris regime that we have today. You know, we started in 1992 with a framework convention that was pretty general. It had an objective of not causing dangerous interference with the climate system. It had a non-binding emissions aim just for essentially developed countries, the so-called Annex 1 parties. And almost everyone in the world joined that. But what followed was a very controversial protocol, which was the Kyoto Protocol. It was extremely binding, highly regulatory. Its emissions reduction commitments only applied to the so-called Annex 1 parties. Developing countries were completely chopped out, and it was rejected by the United States. And that essentially meant that the 2 largest emitters in the world, US because they were out, and China they were in, but they didn't have any commitments, were essentially not subject to this regime. So you can imagine that, views differ about the, success of the Kyoto Protocol. What followed was the Copenhagen Accord / Cancun Agreement, which is almost the same thing, which brought everybody in the world back into the fold. But the only way you were able to do that was to have a completely non-binding approach and very, very flexible in terms of rules and national discretion, right? So that was kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from the Kyoto Protocol. And in a sense, the Paris Agreement is what I think of as like the Goldilocks agreement, where it took, some elements of the Kyoto Protocol, some elements of the Copenhagen approach. It set a numerical temperature goal for the first time, instead of just talking about avoiding dangerous interference with the climate. And otherwise, it was quite a hybrid of the two. It's a hybrid in terms of legal bindingness, if you want to call it that. Certain provisions are binding, certain provisions are not binding. It's a hybrid in terms of the, along the continuum of how regulatory is the agreement versus how much national discretion does it leave to the parties. So anyway, that's my little encapsulation of the many, many years of having, of labor that it took to get to the ultimate Paris framework. Now, Paris took a big step forward recently. You mentioned the Glasgow Conference of the Parties, and let me say a little bit about that. Paris had taken a few hits, which are pretty obvious, after its entry into force in 2016. Donald Trump announced that the United States was going to withdraw. COVID was quite a distraction from in 2020, when parties were supposed to be raising their ambition under the Paris Agreement. They basically, a lot of them were, having to focus on COVID and were not able to do much, and we lost a lot of time. But in part due to the Biden administration and I would call it its enthusiasm for the climate change issue, this latest COP26 accomplished a lot. Many of the major economies, the major emitters in the world, raised their ambition on the road to the COP. This put the world much closer to being on track to a safe temperature goal, a limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade. The parties to the Paris Agreement finished the so-called rule book, which is all the guidelines and procedures under the agreement that will enable its full operationalization. And the parties were also able to adopt a consensus decision called the Glasgow Climate Pact, which has very strong language in it about keeping this 1.5 degree limit within reach, treating the 2020s as the decisive decade, and all kinds of details about what the parties intend to do. So, so that's a very, I would say, recent and good advance. The Paris Agreement has also been highly influential, sort of beyond itself, I would say. It has set the terms of how people talk about climate change. Practically everybody talks about it in terms of either 2 degrees, 1.5. People talk about net zero emission goals. They talk about even in shorthand, Paris aligning as a new word, X, Y, or Z type of action. Paris drives not only the national action of governments, but that of companies, subnational governments. You will hear cities and states talking about Paris aligning, financial institutions, which have now taken up net zero goals, et cetera. The annual conferences of the parties, the COPs, draw that tens of thousands of people, even the end of the year, but they essentially draw note that the Paris Agreement can't really do it alone. It needs other international agreements and institutions to help out. It needs international financial institutions like the World Bank to align themselves with the Paris goals. Certain issues require specialized expertise. I mentioned the International Civil Aviation Organization, also the International Maritime Organization. I mean, both shipping activities and aviation activities are the cause of CO2 emissions and need to be regulated. Climate impacts also are bound to have effects on other fields, outside of climate, such as biodiversity, fisheries, protection of the marine environment, and the treaty bodies and institutions that deal with those issues, need to address those impacts. And some fields, such as trade and investment, actually need to look into whether their regimes could potentially impede climate action. So they're a bit at the in a different position. But maybe most importantly, Paris needs to be supplemented by what some people call minilateral initiatives. And I would give as a great example of this, the Global Methane Pledge, which the United States and the EU initiated a couple months before this most recent COP. By the time the COP was over 100 countries had signed on to this pledge, which in essence is trying to reduce global methane emissions by a certain percentage by 2030. It's not a UN initiative. It doesn't have like consensus of all 200 parties of the UN, but it's incredibly significant from a climate point of view and is a great supplement to what came out of the COP. The last point, because you asked about the US role, I guess I would just say the US has played a pivotal role in the climate regime in both sort of good and bad directions. The US was the largest emitter for a very long time. Now it's been, that role has been taken over by China. So it was always the necessary party in the climate negotiations. It helped shape the Kyoto Protocol and then didn't join. As I noted, that meant that the two largest emitters were basically not covered, which really kind of impeded the effectiveness of the Kyoto Protocol. The flexible shape of the Cancun, Copenhagen outcome was largely to get the US and China in, so it had kind of an indirect influence in that sense on the shape of the development of the regime. US-China engagement has been key to shaping a lot of the agreements along the way. It was certainly key to shaping the Paris Agreement. Paris was preceded by a kind of high-level, presidential level joint announcement between the United States and China. And even this year, we had two agreements with China on the road to Glasgow, which really helped shape that outcome. US withdrawal during the Trump administration had a negative impact on global action, although no country like literally followed in the US footsteps by withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. It certainly had, in some cases, in case of some countries, I would say, probably had a negative effect on their enthusiasm for taking climate action. And finally, last point, the Biden administration has now come back, with a vengeance on the issue of climate change, and it's driving much of the enhanced action that we see today. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent, Sue. Thank you so much for those remarks, and we hope you're able to stick around for the end, where maybe we can get a few questions and answers from the audience. And I know I have a couple questions of my own, but I hope to move on to Jose now. And I'd like to turn to the issue of global public health. And given that we are nearly 2 years into a global pandemic, it's hard to think of an issue that is impacting the world more on a daily basis than global public health. So Jose, we look forward to your remarks on the legal framework that's applicable to the global public health system.
Thank you very much. And as you'll see from the very title here, I took the other framing that of the organizers and talk about rule of law as opposed to multilateralism as such. And let me just say that I think on this issue, I don't think I can be quite as glowing as what we just heard Subini, as my old friend, describe with respect to climate change. And where I'll start is the idea that is promulgated very much within the UN, that the national rule of law and its characteristics can be carried over into the international system, as you see from this quote from Kofi Annan, which still represents officially the UN's position, which is that we can expect the international rule of law to look like the national rule of law in those rule of law states that we admire. That is, and this includes the UN when it is a legal actor and makes law. So that as you read here, it's all persons, including all institutions, including the UN system, including the World Health Organization, should be accountable when it makes law. And that law that it makes should be equally enforceable, independently adjudicated, fairness in the application of the law. It should avoid being arbitrary, and it should have procedural and legal transparency. Let's just say that that's not quite what we're seeing with either the World Health Organization or other institutions that are involved with the pandemic. I would say that most legal scholars, legal philosophers would call this a rather thick description of what we expect from the rule of law, not simply procedurally right, but one that respects, for example, as you see here, fundamental human rights norms and standards. One way of thinking about what Coffey is saying is just to break it down in the familiar ways that Tom Bingham's Rule of Law book did, that basically rule of law at the national level, and here we're saying the international level, should have equal application, be transparent, legally bound discretion that is controlled by courts. Those who make the law should be subject to being controlled by courts, and they should exercise their power in accordance with the purpose for which those powers were conferred without exceeding those limits, and that it should protect human rights, including in respect of this issue, the right to life, the right to health care, for instance. And it should have access to effective remedies. So those who are injured by the law or the responses to COVID should have a place to bring their complaints. If you compare these 6 characteristics of the rule of law to what has actually happened, we have the opposite: unequal application of the international health regs and of the WHO's guidance, with grossly discriminatory results across North, South, and within each country, including the United States, grossly disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable populations, often defined by race, ethnicity, or other criteria. Lack of accessible law, that is, no transparency or very little of it in any case with respect to how the WHO has its temporary recommendations, or other states do with respect to what the World Health Organization says you should do. Nothing to suggest there is any boundary on sovereign discretion. It's been every nation for itself, and lack of international legal limits on either international organizations or on states whenever they exercise their emergency powers, which is how they characterize what they do with respect to COVID, and very little protection of human rights. Blatant violations of the 2 covenants, the civil and political rights covenant and the economic, social, and cultural covenant, even though most states of the planet are bound by both. That is, lots of discrimination with respect to life, lots of discrimination with respect to access to healthcare, to effective remedies, and few, if any, of those remedies exist at the international level. So if you want to accuse China of spreading the so-called China virus, nobody expects that issue to be brought before the ICJ, because the next question would be, well, you, the United States, assuming you're bringing this complaint, and let's assume for the moment that US and China would accept the jurisdiction of that court, well, how much were you to blame, the United States, for not controlling the spread? That is, you were one of the worst to act once the virus was there. The end result is not something that is different from anybody who follows pandemics for the centuries that we've had them on Earth. That is, pandemics frequently are the disease of the poor, frequently are the disease of racial, ethnic, and other groups that have not adequate access to healthcare, don't have access to the medicines that emerge or the vaccines. This portrait by renowned US artist Alice Neal is called Tuberculosis, Harlem, 1940. It's a portrait of Carlos Negron, and it depicts tuberculosis' harsh impact on Latinos in the United States. In other words, this is a very old story. It has affected Ebola and virtually other pandemic. That is the sheer inequality transnationally as well as within states. So in my own work on COVID, the annex to something that's on SSRN, the case for reparations for the color of COVID, I portray 3 case studies through the data that we now have, and it's quite clear the disproportionate impact that affects life expectancy, unemployment, children's access to education, and all the other harsh effects on COVID have been disproportionately felt in the United States on African Americans, Indigenous, Latino communities, and it connects to structural racism within the United States. That is, historically redlined areas that make it harder for social distancing. Usually also have the worst hospitals or the worst access to medical care, etc. In Brazil, the story is even graver. That is, we've had a 1,000-page report from the Brazilian Senate that accuses Bolsonaro of basically a crime against humanity. He was so blatant in his inactions and actions with respect to COVID, calling it a little flu, touting the worst misinformation about what works and doesn't work, and downplaying vaccines. The consequences on Blacks, Indigenous, and Pardo Brazilians, effectively through the color of skin as the characteristic, were devastating. And they were understated because much of what we get from those communities understates the number of deaths. And in India is as predicted by caste. And again, the story is quite familiar in terms of the disproportionate impact. Around the world, I don't have to tell you that what this graph demonstrates, that is, most of us here in New York anyway, are perhaps on our booster shot, when with the rest of the planet, that is in the global south especially, haven't seen yet the first vaccine. And it is important to point out that when it comes to this issue, inequality is the fundamental problem. That is, as we all know, every variant that comes down the line from Delta to now Omicron is due to the fact that we have these kinds of inequalities. That is, there is a utilitarian and not just moral reason why we should care of the disproportionate impacts and what some would now call vaccine apartheid that is occurring, because we all stand to lose if everybody is not vaccinated. So the global inequality, and another annex that I have to the same article, which you can find in SSRN, the second annex, it tries to portray this around the world. And the data that we have, as inadequate as it is, seems to show that being a poor country, simply by having low GNP, is not the accurate predictor of the worst COVID death rates per 100,000. What is a more accurate predictor is how inequality prevails in each country, the Gini coefficients. That is, being poor alone is not what drives COVID into the most horrific territory. It's that you have an unequal society that drives the COVID death rates per 100,000. And what that suggests, that what we call the color of COVID, is a global phenomenon. And what we also know is that we haven't even seen how deeply the problem of inequality really is, because in many societies, including Brazil, including our own, and including places like India, the actual ability to track the people who died of COVID as opposed to other diseases is inaccurate. That is, we grossly underestimate. So right now, we have an official death rate of 5 million or so around the world. Most people believe that it's really 7 million deaths around the world. Those missing 2 million deaths are most likely to be what I would call color of COVID deaths, people who we don't know died, but there tend to be precisely the most vulnerable in each society. So what are we doing about it? So I would say that both the United States and the rest of the planet, the global health reformers, especially at the World Health Organization, are dealing with it not as color of COVID, but color blindness. And you can predict why that is. No state wants to blame itself for what happened. And so the idea here is, from the United States, I've distributed, I hope the organizers distributed the US government's position paper made available to the World Health Organization, where the Biden administration is preferring not a new treaty, but what it calls target amendments to the international health regs, which are binding on all members of the World Health Organization and date back to 2005. Many people think that those international health regs should have been amended with respect to prior inadequate responses, including Ebola. So what the US approach takes up a lot of the old recommendations that have been on the table. They're not original with the US, and they're solid recommendations that would advance some of the rule of law goals, including better transparency with respect to what the World Health Organization does, more impartial, expeditious enforcement and implementation of what leading experts want you to do when you face a pandemic. And the 6 categories here are the types of things that the US is recommending. I think they all make eminent sense. And I do believe that there's a serious prospect that we will make some progress on this. But let's be clear why the Biden administration is preferring this mode. It's preferring this, I think, because there is no way that it can get a new treaty through Congress. And so this is an old recipe book from the Obama administration, whereby whether it's the Paris Agreement, whether it's the Iran deal, we're going to go with things that do not require congressional approval. And so that's why it prefers amending the international health regs, which it thinks it can do without involving Congress. That's the political reason for this mode of reform. The Europeans and at least 20 other countries have backed instead a pandemic prevention framework convention that is modeled on the only other treaty that the World Health Organization has managed to conclude under Article 19 of its constitution that lets it conclude treaties, and that is the Tobacco Framework Convention. So the idea here is we establish broad framing for things that seem very similar, actually, in terms of their goals, as we've just seen with respect to the US, preventing, controlling, detecting, reporting improvements, and better responses to pandemic relief, but all done now in a framework convention where a committee of the parties presides over optional protocols that would permit particular groups of states to deepen their commitments over time. The competition between the two is partly substantive. There are more things you can do through a framework convention that would push outside of the World Health Organization than can be done within an existing set of regulations in that organization. But also the question is, which do you think is faster? The US insists that the amending regs is faster, but that's not necessarily the case. It took many years to amend the international health regs that we have, and it finally took a pandemic to actually do it in 2005. And the Europeans claim that they can do this faster. I have grave doubts about that. That is, as we've just heard from many others, getting a treaty through, especially a treaty as ambitious as the Europeans plan to this to be. And I've also distributed the EU reflection paper so that you can see how ambitious that is a big push. So I think either of these initiatives would demand a lot more by way of resources than anyone, including the Europeans, are willing to put in. The other dimensions of global health reform, many of you will have heard, vaccine equity initiatives, the COVAX to get vaccines into arms in the global South, unilateral vaccine donations, including by the Biden administration, ex gratia donations of vaccines to the planet, and then serious debates at the WTO about whether we should waive IP rights. And about 64 countries, including the Biden administration, believe that that's at least one step that can be taken, but nobody believes that simply waiving IP rights will get the vaccines manufactured and actually into arms. You need more than just waivers. That's a good first step. Mr. Gowan mentioned the Security Council's role. Finally, it passed Security Council Resolution 2565, which was basically a modest step insofar as it urges states to have a ceasefire in conflict situations so vaccines can actually be put into people's arms. That's a modest step, but it is a good step forward insofar as the Security Council could actually get all to agree that something like COVID is indeed likely to endanger international peace and security, which is getting close to what was actually done during Ebola. That is, during Ebola, Resolution 2177 actually declared in its preamble that Ebola was a threat to international peace and security. We haven't even gotten to the stage of proclaiming COVID to be a threat. We're likely to endanger. Of course, this is, for those of you who follow this, the trigger in Article 39 that could actually, if we had the agreement to do so, we could have, let's just take the most extreme case, you could have the Security Council have vaccine mandates like it did in with respect to after 9/11, with respect to global legislation in anti-terrorism legislation under Resolution 1373. Nobody expects that level of cooperation by the Security Council. And frankly, I am not sure that we want the Security Council to deal with this as a security threat. This is still a medical issue. And so I think it is a good idea to have the leading multilateral organization still be something like the WHO or something like the Committee of the Parties under the Framework Convention. But all of this still has great resistance to any idea that states are responsible, whether it's Brazil, India, the US, for what has happened to their own populations. State responsibility or reparations, God forbid, is not something that many people want to discuss. It's regarded as a distraction from the serious work of colorblind global reforms that we've talked about. And they say that the reason we shouldn't talk about it is not just a policy concern, it's that we don't have the rules. We don't have the attribution rules. We don't have the primary or secondary rules in international law to do that. And so my bottom line is that there are likely to be, even in the best case scenario, either the EU's pandemic treaty or the United States amendment of the IHRs, many rule of law gaps will likely to be continued. I just mentioned some of them here. That is, nobody believes that the sovereign states are going to delegate considerable authority to the WHO to actually make its mandates mandatory. They will continue to be recommendations, perhaps slightly more transparent, perhaps taking into account civil society more, and nobody really believes that the new measures will prevent the discriminatory aspect either on the global level or within states that has contributed to the variance and has continued the problem. And so the normative gap at the bottom of this screen is that nobody is really taking seriously the duties that states have to proactively advance the human right to health that is proclaimed in the WHO's constitution, and that is, of course, part of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Just to end this on a much more even controversial note, I argue in my article something that is not on the agenda, but I think should be, which is the case for intra-state, each country coming to terms with its own color of COVID problems. I list many of the reasons for this. I do think that under international law, reparations are called for because of what has happened. And what I mean by reparations are not necessarily financial. We know that under international law, reparations include everything from an apology to changing the law in order to make sure it doesn't happen again. And my point is that COVID claims will come up. They will come up in our national courts. They will slowly come up after exhaustion of remedies, and I do mean exhaustion, through human rights courts. And what I would propose is to anticipate those by ex-ante transitional justice type approaches within each country. And in each country, it could even be at the subsidiary level. So one inspiration, take a look at the bottom of this screen. The New York Board of Health declared in October racism a public health crisis and passed a resolution recommending, among other things, that the city of New York come to terms with the color of COVID as it has been happening in this city for roughly 18 months and participate in a truth and reconciliation process with the affected communities. And the reasons for this I list here: utilitarian justifications to protect public health. We can't expect to prevent future pandemics unless we've come to terms with what has happened in the past. Colorblind reforms will alas mean colorblind continued pandemics and the harshest consequences of them. Thank you, and sorry if I exceeded my time by a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Jose. Even if they were slightly less optimistic than Sue's outlook on the climate front. Kristin, I'd like to shift now to the topic of cyberspace and cybersecurity. And this seems like a space where international law and clear norms that govern cyber activities are really lacking. And so I was hoping that you could help us understand kind of the current status of multilateral efforts to address cyber activities.
Well, thanks, Clayton. I think you're setting me up here to be a little pessimistic, which I plan to fully fulfill, but also perhaps ending on a note of optimism. But thank you, Clayton, to you and to the New York City Bar Association for convening this really interesting discussion. And thanks to Sue and Jose for their really interesting remarks. So I want to use my time to address three issues. The first is to pick up on Sue's point about the terminology of multilateral. The watchword for cybersecurity for a long time has been, correctly in my view, multi-stakeholderism. And so I want to talk a little bit about why multi-stakeholder issues, the multi-stakeholder framing is so important and how it interacts with multilateral institutions like the United Nations. The second point is to talk about how cyber incidents are challenging international law and the role of law and the rule of law. And then the third is the way forward, and hopefully I'll be a little bit optimistic there. So how can states, including the United States and international institutions and non-governmental entities, actually move the ball forward on international law? So let me start with multi-stakeholderism, which is a mouthful. So the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance has long been the de facto way, on the ground way that governance of the internet has happened, with support from the United States and from its allies. And it's often set against a quote unquote multilateral model that would focus exclusively on states. This is a model that's been pushed by China and Russia and their allies. It gets into some of the discussion about the International Telecommunications Union that we've already heard about. But multi-stakeholder governance goes well beyond just internet governance. So there's been a tremendous blurring, and we're seeing increasing evidence of the blurring of the roles of government and non-governmental actors in cybersecurity. So private actors, non-governmental actors are just all over the place. One way to think about this is that they're owners of critical infrastructure. The figure that's often cited, although I haven't seen anyone definitively say where this number comes from, but I'll repeat it here, is that 85% of the critical infrastructure in the United States is owned by the private sector. So the private sector owns key infrastructure that's victimized by hacks, that's victimized by ransomware. But the private sector also often acts as first responders in cyberspace. So these are cybersecurity companies, and this is true even when governments are victims. So we are almost a year out now from the SolarWinds hack, which compromised lots of US government departments, but FireEye, a private company, discovered the breach and alerted the US government. And that was not the first time that a private party has alerted the United States government to a breach of its own systems, much less discovered other compromises throughout the private sector. Another example of this sort of response by the private sector came in the Microsoft Exchange hack, also within the last year. So that's an incident that the United States has attributed to China. It was discovered by another private company. But the interesting blurring comes in the response to it. So the US National Security Council stood up a unified coordination group to run the US response to this incident. And they actually included private sector members. And this is an innovation that the United States has said it will employ going forward. It will be a model for other incident response. And this blurring between the private sector and non-governmental actors and governmental actors isn't just on the defensive side. It's also on the offensive side. So this is an issue with cybercrime groups and the ransomware attacks that have gotten a lot of attention, particularly in the last 6 months. So many ransomware groups are understood to have some relationship to the states where they operate. So either governmental hackers who are moonlighting, some coordination with the state, or maybe even taking direct instruction from the state. Another example of this comes from hacking tools. I'm sure at this point, everyone has heard of NSO Group. This is an Israeli company that sells surveillance software, including to regimes that engage in human rights violations. And some of the best work in tracking this private sector actor has been done by the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. The US government just added NSO Group to the Commerce Department's entity list a few weeks ago. So you see the private sector both responsible for intrusions and also responding to them. So this blurring of roles in cybersecurity and the very important roles played by non-governmental actors brings me to my second point, which is about how cybersecurity is challenging international law and the role of law. So cyber challenges international law in a lot of ways. You gave sort of a little bit of a pessimistic kickoff for my remarks, and I think that's warranted. Let me focus on two ways that cyber challenges international law. So the first of the two is with respect to attribution. So this blurring of relationships between governmental and non-governmental actors that I just talked about makes the attribution of offensive cyber operations more difficult. So attribution is the process of assigning responsibility to whoever carried out an intrusion. And there's both a factual dimension to this and a legal dimension. So the factual side is just who did it, who's responsible, who actually carried out the intrusion. And this is factually complicated. In an interview with the Washington Post about a month ago or a month and a half ago, Rob Joyce, who's the director of NSA's cybersecurity directorate, said that hackers working for China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are increasingly using publicly available hacking tools rather than custom-built ones in order to complicate attribution, in order to make themselves look less like states. And then, so that's just a sort of factual complication. There's also a legal complication. So international law on state responsibility sets a fairly high bar for when a non-state actor's actions can be attributed to a state. So when is a state responsible for the actions of non-state actors? And international law generally requires that a non-state actor be acting under the instructions of or at the direction or control of a state in order for the state to be legally responsible. So these challenges in figuring out the factual side of attribution, because of the blurring of governmental and non-governmental roles, make it hard to hold states responsible for a lot of the bad acts in cyberspace. We're seeing this challenge now with respect to ransomware. So what exactly is the relationship, for example, between Russia and the ransomware groups like Revil and DarkSide that have been causing so much trouble for the United States? So talk about another way that international law challenges cybersecurity, and that's unsettled rules of international law. So you've got the attribution question, but you've also got ongoing dispute and confusion about what exactly international law prohibits with respect to cyber activities. And this is, I think, this is most unsettled below the use of force and armed attack threshold. So many states have coalesced in the last couple of years around the idea, basically a scale and effects test, and that's the US position. So if you have a cyber attack that it causes destruction at the scale of, and it causes effects like the physical damage that you would see from something like dropping a bomb or a missile, then that counts as a use of force or an armed attack. Okay, so progress, right? The problem, though, is that most of the cyber attacks that we're seeing and most of the things that are causing problems around the world are below that use of force threshold. Now, in some ways, that's great, right? I'm not saying we want more attacks above the use of force threshold just for legal parity purposes, of course. But international law is struggling to deal with these lower categories. So that's where things like election interference, ransomware, they fall below the use of force threshold. And the problem there is that states are not really clear about their own positions or about other states' positions about whether international law actually prohibits those activities or exactly when. So there are a couple of legal rules at play here. Let me just give you a sort of a brief overview of what the debates are. So below the use of force threshold, the kind of next prohibition is the prohibition on intervention. So the United States and other countries have said that the exact boundaries of that prohibition aren't clear. So a state has to invade the domain reservé of another state, and it has to engage in coercion. But what does that mean? We've started to see some examples from states. So Brian Egan, who was the State Department legal advisor at the end of the Obama administration, gave a speech in 2016 where he said that a cyber operation by a state that interferes with another country's ability to hold an election or that manipulates another country's election results would violate the prohibition on intervention. The UK has said similarly that an intrusion that manipulates electoral results to alter the results of an election, or one that interferes with the operation of parliament or the stability of their financial system, might violate intervention. We've seen other examples. New Zealand has taken a pretty broad stance on this. They've said, for example, that a cyber operation that involves a prolonged and coordinated cyber disinformation campaign that undermines a state's public health efforts during a pandemic, to refer back to Jose's comments, of course, that might violate non-intervention. But the basic point here is states don't exactly agree on what intervention covers. Beyond that, they don't even agree about whether there is another type of international law violation. And this debate centers on the question of whether sovereignty is a rule of international law or merely a principle that informs other rules. So this would be a lesser violation of international law below intervention. The UK has taken a strong position that there is no such thing. Sovereignty is just a principle, it's not a rule. And the US seems to be leaning that way. But there's momentum in the other direction. A number of states, France, Netherlands, Austria, Czech Republic, Germany, New Zealand, they've all seemed to endorse the sovereignty as a rule position. But even among those states that do seem to say that sovereignty is a rule, they have different lines that they're drawing. So a number of states have adopted a sort of threshold. So de minimis violations of sovereignty don't necessarily violate international law, but over a certain threshold, they would. A third principle of international law that's caused debate is the idea of due diligence. So this, I'll just quote the Tallinn manual version of this to cite a multi-stakeholder effort here. So the Tallinn manual says that a state must exercise due diligence in not allowing its territory or cyber infrastructure under its governmental control to be used for cyber operations that affect the rights of and produce serious adverse consequences for other states. So there's disagreement among states about whether due diligence is required or what exactly due diligence would require in the cybersecurity space. This is a principle that's best known from international environmental law, from the idea of transboundary pollution. This helps a little bit with some of the attribution problems with respect to ransomware, for example. So even if you can't draw the link between a hacker and a state, you can say the state is responsible for its own international law violation because it didn't address harms coming out of its territory. But at the same time, the argument is a bit circular. So due diligence is triggered by an underlying international law violation. If you don't know whether there's an underlying international law violation, it doesn't get you very far. Okay, so that was probably all a little bit confusing and a little bit deliberately so, because that's the state of play. That's the point. International law is confused, states don't agree, and this is an area that needs more progress. Those are the debates, but how do we actually move forward? That brings me to my third point. And so I want to talk a little bit about the various processes and actors who are trying to make progress on clarifying these rules of the road for cyberspace. There's been, I think, less whiplash about the US position on cybersecurity and engagement in some of these international discussions than there has been across other issues. We haven't seen the dramatic reversals of US position that we've seen in other areas like climate change. So the US has been participating in UN processes, did during the Trump administration, and has continued in the Biden administration. And last year, we saw actually two different reports coming out of the United Nations. So there's the UN Group of Governmental Experts, which has been a long-running series of discussions among groups of states. So this is very multilateral in the state-focused sense. And it's resulted in a number of consensus reports. So the most recent one issued in July was the 6th UN Group of Governmental Experts. The other process is the UN Open-Ended Working Group. So that's actually a multi-stakeholder process. The Open-Ended Working Group, or OEWG, was proposed by Russia, which has in other parts and other times pushed a multilateral states-only model. But we ended up with these two parallel processes, and the OEWG pushed by Russia ended up being the more multi-stakeholder. And both of those UN processes resulted in reports that are significant for the consensus that they represent. So the GGE report reiterated, as the last GGE report in 2015 did, that international law, and in particular the UN Charter, applies to states' use of information and communications technologies. But it also went further. It noted that international humanitarian law applies in situations of armed conflict. And it fleshed out 11 norms of responsible state behavior that had been included but not explained in a prior GGE. The OEWG report, the other one, the multi-stakeholder one, also acknowledges the importance and the applicability of international law and emphasize these norms of responsible state behavior. But progress, states are talking, but both of these reports still leave important legal issues unresolved. So all the ones I just set out about whether there is or is not a rule of sovereignty, whether there is or is not a rule of due diligence, much less what those mean, are not settled in these reports. So, for example, the GGE report frames due diligence as a norm, not as international law. So it kind of splits the baby, goes down the middle between the states that say, yes, there is a rule of due diligence, and no, there's not. So there's still progress to be made. And the OEWG's mandate has been extended till 2025. So we're going to see those discussions continue. The other place we're seeing progress is with respect to states in smaller groups. So this is sort of Sue's mini-lateral idea. We're seeing groups of like-minded states taking positions and denouncing particular kinds of behavior. So for example, on ransomware, the United States in just the last couple of months has indicted ransomware operators, sanctioned cryptocurrency exchanges for facilitating ransomware payments, and sanctioned individual ransomware operators. And reportedly, US Cyber Command has also taken direct action against some of the ransomware gangs. But there's still not the clarity about international law. So you see states, often the United States, but often the United States acting with allies, condemning behavior, issuing sanctions, denouncing it. But there's still not clarity about those countries' international legal views. So let me try and end on a hopeful note here. One place I think there has been substantial progress in the last couple of years, and where I expect we'll continue to see progress, is on transparency about legal views. And I think there's value to the transparency about states' legal views, that in a way that it can help avoid conflict, even if there's not agreement on the legal views. So knowing where other states' red lines are and how they're going to consider certain actions to merit a response or merit a claim of an international law violation is itself some progress. The UN processes, both the GGE and the OEWG, have helped to foster this. So we've seen states submitting their legal views to those bodies, to those processes. And I think that the existence and ongoing discussions in those fora has also spurred states to do other things to clarify their views. So releasing white papers, speeches, position papers, setting out their ideas about international law, both with respect to their own positions and flagging areas where they see international law as being unsettled. And these UN processes, I think, are feeding into a broader ecosystem. So it's not just states, it's not just the UN. There are also ongoing multi-stakeholder processes. So there's things like the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which the US recently announced it was signing on to. There's a project to revise the Tallinn Manual, which is a rule book intended to kind of be a restatement of how international law applies to cyber. I've been part of something called the Oxford Process, which is an effort largely among academics, but with some government participation as well, to try and set out the consensus position about how international law applies to particular issues. So these are positive developments. Transparency and greater clarity, I think, is a good thing. But I'm not optimistic that we will see any kind of agreement in the short term, at least among all these many entities and stakeholders who have equities in the cyber issues. So maybe a mixed bag at the end. So some progress, lots more work to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristin, and it's nice to have a little bit of optimism at the end of your remarks. And it wouldn't be a multilateral event without some acronyms thrown in there. So it's good that you got those in there as well. I'm going to start with you. We only have a couple minutes here, but I wanted to at least follow up with each of you with one question, some from the audience, some that I haven't. Kristin, I'm wondering if you discussed these parallel tracks within the UN system, as well as several other multi-stakeholder tracks as you discussed. And I'm wondering if those various mechanisms risk creating some confusion or more confusion as to what the norms or agreed upon norms or rules are within cyberspace.
I think there's a risk of that, and that was a big concern when both the UN, the latest UN GGE, and the open-ended working group were established a couple of years ago. There was concern that these two parallel processes would sort of run into one another and not remain in parallel, and that actually really didn't happen. So I think my bigger concern going forward is not that we'll get too many norms and conflicting norms, but that we still have too few or too little international law. I think that, it's what's more likely to happen is sort of failures of consensus and failures of agreement, not too many competing, sets of agreements. Just not to say there are not disagreements. I just think the way those disagreements will manifest is in a failure to agree and failure to coalesce around norms or law, not in competing outcomes.
Great, thanks. And Sue, I'd like to briefly turn to you and to use Kristin's term of art, the multi-stakeholderism. We did have a question from the audience about the private sector engagement in the climate issue, and I'm wondering if there's been sufficient engagement from the private sector to really move the ball forward with regard to combating climate change.
Yeah, the involvement of the private sector has just skyrocketed in recent years. It's interesting when you go back to the Kyoto Protocol days, it was setting aside the fact that the US didn't join and all of that. It really was just an intergovernmental agreement. There were a couple companies that were probably pro Kyoto Protocol in the United States, and they were basically maybe like renewable countries that would benefit from reduction in fossil fuels. But really nothing much to speak of. When the Trump administration was considering whether to pull out of the Paris Agreement, as a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal. That would have been unthinkable several years before, from companies saying we should not pull out of this agreement. That was basically, a decade before that would have been considered sort of anti-company corporate interests. The Paris Agreement itself did a lot to generate interest in the private sector. Unlike most international agreements, it had a very heavy, what they called non-party stakeholder component, which included not just companies, but also NGOs and even governments and subnational governments like cities and states. And so there, when we get into the details, but there was a lot of sort of, I called it like the Greater Metropolitan Paris Agreement, because there was a bunch of architecture that came out of Paris that went beyond the like literal intergovernmental agreement, and it's only grown since then. In the United States, also, when the United States government, the federal government, did pull out of the Paris Agreement, or announced that it would pull out, corporate America actually came out in full force in this group called "We Are Still In," a movement that was basically trying to show, the federal government is not monolithic, or the United States is not monolithic. The corporate America, not all of it, but much of it, stands behind the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Obama emissions target, et cetera, et cetera. And that the enthusiasm has just grown and grown, and there are a million examples I could point you to, but that's a longer conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sue. Jose, I wanted to turn to you last with the last couple of minutes that we have, and we were able to distribute the US and the EU proposals with regard to targeted amendments or a new international agreement. And I think you pointed out that they both have similar objectives in their aims, but neither is really sufficient. I'm wondering if you think either is better suited to fill the rule of law gaps that you discussed in your remarks, and if either one would be able to address the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on poorer countries as well as minority communities.
Well, that's an intriguing question, but my bottom line is that neither of them are really attuned to this. I can speak from having sent my suggestions to one of the people involved in the EU reflection paper, who said, no, that's way beyond our mandate. That's just not what we're talking about. I guess if it were feasible, politically feasible, I am sympathetic to the idea of a framework convention, because I think the Tobacco Convention has worked fairly well. But the key there is to have states that are already convinced that they want to do tobacco control. And it seems that when states are already convinced, as possibly they're getting to the point, if we believe Sue, on climate change, then you can accept a soft managerial approach where you persuade, including the private sector, to do the things that the Framework Convention insists on. But right now, in some states, this issue just on vaccines has become, including our own, a highly partisan issue. And it becomes very hard for an organization like the WHO or a framework convention through protocol to insist, for example, on vaccine mandates. So if you look at the framework convention, it says things like, one of the things you do is you bar politicians from accepting money from Reynolds Tobacco. Well, I guess that's feasible if you already accept that the private sector and your politicians are not going to be involved in encouraging smoking. I don't think we're there, certainly not in the United States, where we have partisan divisions on things like vaccines. So, but I do think that the advantage of a pandemic framework convention is that it can reach far broader than simply reforming the WHO. I and many others believe that the World Health Organization is overstretched. We're asking it to do too much, all the way from research to actually handle outbreaks, and that at least the advantage of a broader treaty conception is to send some things to other places, including to hybrid institutions. And even perhaps the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, if they want to pay for it, I'm happy to have them do it. You can't easily do that by simply amending the IHRs.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think we have to leave it there, given that we're running out of time, and it's probably time for everybody to go grab some dinner. But I wanted to thank everybody for attending tonight's session. I really want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our speakers. Richard, Hugh, Sue, Jose, and Kristin really made this an engaging conversation, and a bit of pessimism and a bit of optimism, which I think is probably the right tone to take with regard to this subject. So thank you all, and I hope everybody stays safe, and good evening.
Good evening. Thank you.